My name is Anita Gross, and I'm here to interview, and we are at the Kindertransport Association conference in Washington, D.C. Today's date is June 6, 1998. Would you please introduce yourself?
Well, my name is Kurt Fuchel, F-U-C-H-E-L. At least that's what it is now. When I was born, it was Fuchel, F-U umlaut, C-H-S-L. But it got changed along the way.
When was that?
Well, my parents were naturalized French after the war, very soon after the war, because my father had served in the resistance movement. And since I was underage at that time, I was automatically naturalized with them. And the French government made us change the name to something a Frenchman could hope to pronounce.
So it was until that time period. So let's go back again. When were you born?
I was born on September the 11th, 1931 in Vienna, the only child of Rudolf and Olga Fuchel. My father, Rudolf, was Viennese and was a sort of middle-level bank manager. My mother, Olga, had been born in Hungary, where her family had come from, but had moved to Vienna, I think, when she was around 5. And they lived at 113 Maria-Hilfer-Straße, which is in the 6th, whatever it's called, district, Bezirk, I think, 6th. My mother always assured me this was one of the better ones, but I wouldn't know. And life was pleasant enough until 1938 or so.
Now, before we go into 1938, let's just talk a little bit about your family. Your father, Rudolf, when did his family come to Vienna? Do you know?
No, I don't know. I think they've been there for quite a while. In fact, my father actually was drafted into the Austrian army in the First World War, but he never saw any action. He was drafted about a month before the war ended. But theoretically, he, was fighting against the British, although he never really fought. So they've certainly been there since the early 1900s.
Did he tell you about his war years?
The second, very little. The Second World War, he taught us some of it. The first one was really nothing. I mean, he was drafted and then the war ended. In France, he did have some adventures.
Now, did he have any brothers or sisters?
He had a brother and a sister. The brother died fairly young. I'm not sure of what. It seems to be one of those things a family prefers not to talk about. I don't know. I heard he died of a broken heart, he died of appendicitis, or he committed suicide. I never got the story straight. I never knew.
When you say young, what do you mean by that? How old do you think that was?
Probably in his 30s, early 30s.
Do you know what his name was?
No, I don't, as a matter of fact. My mother, my father also had a sister, Elsa, who was 13 years older. Elsa I knew quite well because she had somehow gotten out and lived in Nice very openly in a beautiful apartment, stone's throw from the beach. She had, I believe, 2 or 3 husbands in her lifetime. I used to go there when I lived in France for holidays. When Hitler came into Austria, Elsa left with her husband to, I guess, for France. And my father smuggled her jewelry across the border at the risk of his life. My mother was furious with him, and he just said, Elsa can't live without money, and that was that.
So they were very close, it sounds like.
Well, they were 13 years apart, so I don't think they were that close, but anyway, my father did this for Elsa, and my mother, I don't think, ever forgave Elsa. Elsa was a very hard woman, very self-centered, but I sort of liked her. You knew where you were with her. I always enjoyed my travels there.
Did she have children?
No, Elsa never had any children. So We had a very small family on my father's side.
And your mother's side, when did you said she's from Hungary.
Yes.
Did any of her other family come over, or?
Well, the family consisted of, the immediate family was her and 3 brothers. One brother died very young, at about 21, of diabetes, which at that time was incurable. And my mother, I think, has never quite got over it. She was always very anxious. If I ever exhibited signs of thirst, she would immediately assume that I needed a blood test and so on. And she was always very worried about health. The 2 brothers were both very handsome men, very good looking, and athletes. Both were soccer players. Imre, the younger one.
What was his name?
Imre, or Jim in English.
How do you spell it?
I-M-R-E, Imre. He was, was an average sort of, club soccer player, nothing extraordinary. He was also a very charming man and delightful, fun-loving. Leo, the older one, was more serious. And Leo was a major star, an international player. He played for the Austrian national team. He was captain of the Hakoa, which was an all-Jewish club in Vienna. He also played in the 1928 and 32 Olympics, and he played for French teams. And indeed, before the war came, he took his family to Malta because he was offered a contract to play football, English football, there. And in fact, he came to the States much the same way, and his oldest daughter was born in the States.
So you're still in touch with that family?
I'm in touch with Nora quite often. Leo died a few years ago at age 84 of Alzheimer's.
And how about Imre?
Imre died perhaps 15 years before that of a heart attack. Imre, I have a very warm memory of. In particular, his wife, Erika or Ricky, I remember her very well because when I was in England during the war, somehow she managed to visit England. I don't know how. Indeed, he did too at another time. He taught me how to play chess, not that I was any good at it. And she visited me once. And I remember her like a ray of sunshine coming into my life. She was the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, and very, very nice too. She was just really, I've always had this extremely warm feeling about her. And many years later, I remember she came to the United States to, so to speak, say goodbye to everybody because she had cancer, and I drove her to the airport. I didn't know what to say. There's very, very little one can say, and she died soon afterwards.
Now, did she have children too?
Imre and Ricky had one son. They were in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And at one point, Peter, his son, and his wife, Nelly, who was Argentinian, came to the United States. But somehow it didn't work out for them. Peter knows several languages. He was in banking. He got a job. But Nelly never learned any English. She was stuck in the house with 3 small girls. And somehow it didn't work out well. Also, Peter had developed a very, I'm going to, I think, say something bad, but about a very Hispanic attitude. I mean, he didn't want her to go out without him. And since she didn't speak a word of English, what was a poor woman to do? Anyway, after a couple of years, they packed up, went back there. And some years later, he sent my mother, with whom he corresponded, a picture of the 3 girls, all with crosses on. And my mother not only refused to ever write to him, but wouldn't give me his address until years and years later. Recently, I've been in touch with him, and we have communicated. My uncle Leo had 2 daughters, he and his wife Hilda. Hilda, by the way, is 92 about 91 years old. Last year she celebrated her 90th birthday.
Wow.
They have two daughters. Nora is the oldest, very nice young woman, earlier on, and who lived in Israel and actually became quite a good painter. Then came to New York. She married a man, Kurt Underman, who came from, I believe, Argentina. And Leo wasn't happy with the match. He was only a poor tailor. But some years later, he owned a whole line of dry cleaning establishments and a tailor shop, and has done very, very well. And he's also a delightful man and an accomplished pianist, although he cannot read music. I mean, he can make a living as a nightclub entertainer easily. So I'm very fond of them both, and I don't see very much of them. Mm. Leo's younger daughter is, alas, a tragedy. As best as I can make out the story, when she was born, the doctor hadn't yet arrived, so the nurses tried to hold the birth back, with the result that she was sort of brain damaged. She was very intelligent, could speak several languages, but I'm not quite sure what was wrong. But I believe that around about the time of puberty, maybe she acted up in some way which disturbed them greatly, and they sought the best medical advice at that time, which was to do a, I forgot the name.
Lobotomy?
Lobotomy. Mm-hmm. So that was a disaster, and Mary became a sad, hugely fat, obese lump of a woman who spent most of the whole week in Creedmoor Hospital and came home on weekends. Once in a while, the touch of intelligence was there. She knew who I was. She remembered, but it was very sad, and she died about 2 years ago.
Mm. Do you remember your father's family, his at all?
No, I do not, I'm afraid, remember my father's side of the family. I do remember my mother's mother very well indeed. I remember very little from Vienna, but when I joined my parents in France after the end of the war, because that's when my parents had been hidden and survived, it was a difficult situation. I spoke only English. My parents spoke German, and my mother probably knew a little Hungarian. But my grandmother spoke English and German, no French.
How did that
So
happen?
she was, well, she had spent the war years in Malta. In fact, she was a British subject. So
What was her name?
her name was Verona Drucker, or her maiden name was Maltash. I don't know how you spell it.
Mm.
And she was, of course, my communication route with my parents until I learned enough French. And she was also, in many ways, my best friend. She was firm with me, but I always somehow confided in her rather than my parents, who were dreadfully upset always in the early days, because they had let me go as a 7-year-old, and when I came back as a 16-year-old, my mother especially wanted to start up where she left off, and at 7 I had other interests. That's it. I mean, at 16 I had other interests, and at 7, so it was very difficult.
And your grandmother Verona, did she have a husband who was around?
Her husband had also survived and had come to France.
What was his name?
His name was Adolf, and in fact I want to talk a little about that family in a moment. And had survived the war, but before I rejoined my parents, he died of I think a ruptured appendix, which was diagnosed too late. He was 76, not exactly young. Not that long ago, a couple of years ago, I was at a family reunion of my wife's family. My wife, as you know, has a large Italian family behind her.
That's Connie.
Connie, that's Connie. And there was this big family reunion, and as usual, I was the photographer of the family. So there am I looking through the viewfinder at this collection of people, and suddenly another picture flashes in my mind. One which my mother gave me and which sits around. It's a big one. And it shows my grandfather, his parents, and his brothers and sisters. And there were 13 children in that family. He was one of 13 children.
Oh my gosh.
And only 2 survived the Holocaust. And one of them went to Australia and nobody knows what happened to him.
And do you know what his name is?
No, I don't. I have a list of the names, but I don't know who on the picture they refer to. But my mother sometimes took that picture, went through the list, the litany of this one was deported, this one when she was told to go to the Brown House, which was the Nazi headquarters in Vienna, committed suicide and by jumping off a building, and this couple also, a couple committed suicide, and these, anyway, they all, you know, these were deported, and she goes through the whole list, and I don't know who's who, but as I say, of these 13, only 2 survived, and only one we knew where, and that was my uncle, my grandfather.
And so you had this flash of
The flash of this picture, and I suddenly was overwhelmed by a tremendous sadness when I realized that if history had been different, I too could have had a large family. And there it is, and it's, I think of it sometimes.
Yeah. So, let's see. At this, I wonder now, when you were living in Vienna, you say you have not too much memory really from Vienna. Do you remember what your family life was like?
Yes, I do to some degree. We lived in a, what to me seemed a large apartment, very high ceilings with a sort of, you know, border about a foot below the level of the ceilings, very ornate, very airy as I remember. And my father had a huge cage of parakeets, and he used to show them to me and allow me to peek through a little hole in the nesting areas where they sat on their eggs. And you know, my father was always showing me things. The family, I think, consisted of my parents. My grandmother would come in very often. My cousins and, you know, Leo would visit. There was a nursemaid called Mitzi who looked after me. And in fact, I was always surrounded by people and caretakers, and my mother boasts that I was toilet trained at age 9 months. I assume someone always followed me around. No wonder I have problems. So it was a, you know, very carefree life.
Was it religious at all?
Well, no, it was what I guess Reformed Judaism. We celebrated the big holidays, Passover, Seder, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and that was about it.
Were you trained in any Hebrew?
Not at age 7. My parents read Hebrew. They don't understand it, but they can read it. I was too young. When I went to England, I did have some training, but very little.
And what do you recall as, I know you're quite young still, but did you recall having friends at that time? And
Yes, I had school friends and the boys I played with, and I also played with my cousin. Particular, I remember one very unfortunate young boy who had a deformed hand, and the image used to scare me of sort of fingers which looked like little balls, and at times I used to have nightmares about that. You always remember the worst things somehow.
And were these a mixture of Jewish and non-Jewish, or was it mostly Jewish people?
I think it was probably a mixture, because I did start school and go to a school which was, I think I went to school at age 4, I guess a preschool, and I'm pretty sure it was not a Jewish school. In fact, my parents were thoroughly assimilated at that time in Vienna. Now, after the Anschluss, I had to leave my school. You know, all Jews were not allowed to go to that school. For a little while we went to another school, and that one was closed. And then finally I had to take a tram to the end of the line and walk through some woods where there was a school set up in somebody's house for Jewish children.
And you did this alone?
I did this alone after a while, up to a point. Apparently, I used to tell people in the tram, since I was a very talkative boy, I used to tell them what a dreadful man Herr Hitler was. I used to believe Herr was his first name. And that, because of him, my father couldn't work anymore, and people sort of got the word back to my parents that this was perhaps unwise. And after that, I think my father, who was no longer working now, would accompany me on the tram and bring me home again.
Now, do you recall when your father stopped working?
Not specifically, but I know there was a sort of pall over the household, and my mother got a job making artificial flowers out of silks, and at one point she burnt herself with hot irons, and sort of making it used to be something that was quite common in those days.
She did this at home?
At home, yes.
So your mother took over the support responsibility?
To some degree. I mean, she made some money. I don't imagine it was a lot.
Well, do you remember the atmosphere changing, concern, worry about the situation?
Well, I think they spared me much of it, but I guess I sensed something was wrong. And then suddenly, we had to give up our apartment. And a neighbor gave us a room in her house to sleep in, all three of us. What had happened was that our apartment had been photographed by a photographer who was, wanted the pictures who was making the pictures for an interior decorator who liked the way it looked. And this picture, with my mother posing next to a dog, were displayed in this decorator's window. And a woman who was a member of the Nazi party saw it, and she came to the house and said, I'd like to see it.
Oh, sorry. So let's go ahead.
Okay, so this Frau Janupa came to the apartment and said she'd just like to see it because she, saw the picture, and my parents graciously show her around. And a few days later, she comes back with a piece of paper declaring that she was now the owner of this apartment, and that we had 6 hours to get out and leave everything behind. So my parents were very upset. Naturally, my father said, you're really awful. I mean, they said that you lie, how dare you come in here and take all that we've worked for? And she said, if you say anything else, I'll have you sent to a concentration camp. And I apparently, who had been listening at the door, ran in at that moment. I don't remember it, but that's what I've been told, and screamed at this Frau Janova, you're a bad woman, you lied to us when you were here last. And she said, take the child out of here. Anyway, my father said he was going over to the Brown house. My mother wouldn't let him because he said, you could just get into trouble. She went over, and she told the officer there that, look, I have a sick child at home. I can't get out in 6 hours. So she said, well, you have until tomorrow morning. And Frau Janova said, well, what if they take some of my things? And the officer assured her that they wouldn't dare. So we moved out next morning to this neighbor who offered us a room. And a few weeks later, I left on the kinder transport.
Okay, so this was all in 38 or 39?
Probably 39, early 39, or middling 39.
Mm-hmm. So when you moved out, was your mother and father able to take in many of their belongings with them?
Well, certainly not the furniture. They, being good Germans, they took every piece of official documentation they've ever had. They also took all the family photos, a few little trinkets, whatever jewelry my mother had, which wasn't very much. I guess they took, something, my father's stamp collection, things like that. They sent my toys to an uncle in North America.
Your toys?
My toys, or the ones, because I could only take a few with me, including a sort of a toy where you actually built houses of real miniature bricks. And it was sent to this uncle in North Africa, but then we couldn't get a visa for North Africa, so that's the last I saw of my toys.
And who was this uncle? Do you remember?
I don't know, some relative. I don't know. I don't recall him at all. So I left, on the Kindertransport.
Well, now, do you recall them discussing it prior to your departing?
No, I don't. I recall very little. I do vaguely recall the train and them sort of, standing outside, and I've been told that I was sort of looking glum, and my father through the window said, "Smile," and I smiled. And an SS officer was passing by, seeing this, said, "So young and already a hero." And that was that.
Do you remember packing?
No, I don't. I know I had one suitcase with a number on it. Fairly big number, like 360 something. I don't remember the exact number, but it was, 3 digits at least.
Do you know if your parents tried to get any special clothing for you to prepare for this trip?
No, I don't know. Just as well they didn't, as I'll tell you in a minute. I don't recall really nothing about the train, but I do recall the hold of the ship. I seem to remember, a cavernous, huge hold, at least for a little boy, and there were sort of bunks in it, and the Red Cross nurses gave us tea and presumably something to eat all night long, because it was about an overnight trip to Harwich in England.
Did you know anybody else on this train?
Well, nobody I immediately knew, but I did. But one of the people who was on that train, I knew afterwards. I don't recall anyone specifically who I knew.
Do you remember experiencing it as an adventure or something personal?
I think more as an adventure.
Mm-hmm.
I don't recall at that moment being terribly distressed. Now, when we went to Harwich, the Cohen family who had agreed to take me, which is unusual. You see, I already knew which family I was going to.
Yeah, how did you find that out?
Well, the story there is that Norwich in England used to be a center for shoe manufacture. And a Viennese shoe salesman was visiting Norwich, and he got in touch with the Jewish community and said, look, we have major problems, and we'd like people to take in some children and do something. And the community responded. It was a small community of less than 100 families. And probably, I didn't know them all, but I believe around 20, maybe 25 kids did end up with families, which I think is quite a large percentage. In particular, I was scheduled to go to the home of Percy and Mariam Cohen, and this little girl who was also on the transport, whose name was Erica, went to Mariam's sister, who lived about 200 yards down the street.
What was Erica's last name?
Erica Rosenbaum at that point. When the Cohens picked me up in their car at Harwich and took me to their home, I do remember walking in the house, seeing the small sort of vestibule and then stairs going to the upstairs, and my future adoptive brother John sitting about halfway up, looking very shy. John is about 2.5 years younger than I. And the family was sort of gathered around to inspect me, which consisted of Percy, Mariam, and the maid who ran the household with something of an iron hand. She was about 4 feet tall, blue eyes, blonde, real spitfire, but we sort of liked her. And I'm told she took one look at me, bedraggled as I was, and said, "Do we really have to keep it?" Anyway, apparently they took me upstairs, stripped me, scrubbed me head to foot, burnt my clothes, dressed me in English clothes, and then the family met downstairs and we had a chicken dinner. And that I remember, and that was also a language I could understand. So
Did you speak any English at this point?
No. Well-meaning friends and neighbors came in and tried to talk Yiddish to me, which didn't help any, since Yiddish was not spoken in my household. But somehow, I guess, communication was established. Mariam tells me that I cried at night, and she used to rock me to sleep and give me chocolate, and, they cared for me.
So they had John, and who else was in the family?
John, and later on, Percy's spinster sister came to live with us.
Okay.
But the Cohens also had only one son, John.
So you felt you became part of the family, or?
Yes, I certainly did. To a very large degree, at least. The first order of business was, of course, that I should learn English. And they had me go to, down the block, there was an elderly German was living, and he was supposed to give me English lessons, and I was terrified of the poor man. I say poor now, at that time, he was tall, cavernous-looking, old, with huge, thick glasses, and I was terrified of him, and the result is I learned English in record time. Now, of course, I realize a poor man must have been in an untenable situation. But 6 weeks later, I wrote to my parents in English. I no longer speak German. I never have, and I've never been able to relearn it. Even when I lived with my parents and they talked German all around me. That I regret now very much, but there we are.
Do you recall the name of the teacher?
No.
And did you go to any other school at that point, or that was?
Well, that was to learn English. Then I guess at the next semester, I went to a school known as Anita College. Anita College was what Americans would call a private school, that's to say people paid to go. Mm-hmm. It was small, probably at most 130, 140 students, in all classes, from, I guess, first grade to whatever, to age 16, which was the school leaving age in Great Britain at that time. It was difficult for me at first, of course, because of English, my accent. Some people used to make fun of me. But the teachers were kind, and I did well in school.
Was this a mix of Jewish and non-Jewish?
Oh, yes. In fact, there were very few Jewish children.
So the Cohens, what was their religious?
They were Jewish. They were like my parents. They celebrated the big holidays, period.
Mm-hmm. So you were comfortable with
I was comfortable with that.
Now, was John also going to the same school?
Yes, he was a bit younger, so he probably started a year or so later. A couple of years later, perhaps. I don't know exactly.
And your family, the Cohens, paid for your attending this school?
Well, I never thought about it, but I learned fairly recently in talking to Mariam that the headmaster and owner of the school didn't charge for me. And, I never knew that, but it was a very nice gesture.
And was this school close to where you were living?
Yes, it was in walking distance.
Oh, okay.
So at school I learned all the normal subjects, including Latin, which I hated and never learned very much. French, which I swore I had no need to learn because I'd never go to France.
And did you develop friends at this point?
Oh, yes. Yes, occasionally there was traces of anti-Semitism. Someone would call me a dirty Jew and whatever, but I soon learned, to kick a ball, in the winter and hit a cricket ball in the summer, and I fit sort of in. I was reasonably good at sports, and I did, I fit in and had friends. I used to play ping pong with them, which is a story in itself. as in most schools in England, the day is started by an assembly, and where the headmaster makes an announcement, and then whoever there's a religious, one of these, a preacher, a Protestant, whatever, minister, who then says morning prayer. But when the time came for that, I and about 3 other Jews and about 5 Catholics went out the back into a back room where we played ping pong. Actually, the Catholics probably, I believe, had it a little harder than Jews. People, there was more resentment against them. People would think I was German, so there would be resentment against that, but they eventually learned that, the difference between, those Germans and others. So I was happy in the school. I did well.
And were you corresponding with your family during this period?
Well, my parents got out through Italy and into the south of France, round about Nice.
And when was that?
Soon after I left.
Oh.
And they worked their way westward in the south of France until they came to the Tarn region, sort of in that area, central area there, rather isolated. And it was possible to write to them for the first 2 years until 1942, when the south of France was nominally at least free. Mm-hmm. Then when the Nazis took over the entire France, my parents had to go into hiding. And they were hidden by some extremely wonderful people in that area.
Were you notified that they had to go into hiding?
No, we just didn't get letters. I remember before that Percy used to stand over me and say, "You are not going out to play until you've written to your parents." But I really had this desperate urge to be assimilated, to be accepted by this family. And so I threw out German wholesale, and I didn't want to write to my parents and had to be practically forced. I know this happened. I can't recapture the feelings of it.
Were they an affectionate family?
Yes. They were affectionate, fun-loving family. Yes.
And your family, as you had left them, were they affectionate also, or no?
Yes. My mother, in fact, used to be somewhat smothering in that respect. Yes.
So you had that continuity.
Yes, right. They were not very different from my parents, I think.
Did they write to your family?
Yes, I think they did, and they told them how I was doing, and they did, I'm sure.
Yeah. So you lost contact in 42, and then right. What happened at that point?
Well, life went on. I didn't think of it at all. And when the war ended, we suddenly got news from them. They were alive. They were living in the town of Vavre, in that part of France. And they said that they would very much like their son back. Well, this was dreadful news to me. But Percy persuaded them to wait a year, so that I could finish my English high school. And also to allow them to establish themselves somewhere. So my parents moved to Toulouse, which is a pretty large city, and they, got an apartment there. My father got a job, and in 1947, I don't remember the exact date.
Do you remember what time of year?
I think it was spring. What happened is that the Cohens took me to Paris. And my parents came up from Toulouse, and we met at Paris. I met them in Paris.
Do you remember that meeting?
Yes, I do very clearly. We were waiting outside the hotel where we told them we were staying, and I saw them approaching in the distance, and I sort of couldn't look at them. Instead, I looked into the store window. And watch their reflection in that. But I felt a very strong emotion. And then I know we had a meal together. I don't quite know how we communicated. I think my parents probably spoke a little English.
But the Cohens were with you still?
Oh yes, they were with me. Not John, I think just Percy and Marion. And then we separated, and next morning my parents took me back to Toulouse. And I remember with some surprise that Percy was in tears when he said goodbye to me. I never realized that, he cared that much. Anyway, we went to...
And how about Miriam?
Miriam was a cooler person. She was loving, but she was, she was not that emotional, perhaps.
Did you make any agreement with them that you were going to keep contact and that sort of thing?
I don't recall it formally, but there was no question that I would.
Mm-hmm.
And indeed I did. I visited very frequently. Let me tell you a little bit about the family. Percy came from a fairly large family, 6 or 7, I forget now. He was, though, a musician. He was a violinist, and he owned or ran his own dance band, which was quite well known. So he was something of a celebrity, although his formal education was very modest, I'm sure. I think his family came from Poland, a generation or so earlier. And most of them, like the oldest brother in their family, was the managing director of a small factory which made women's clothes. The sister, I think, worked as a bookkeeper there, and one of the other brothers was a presser, another an engine driver. But Percy, because of his musical talent, was more of a celebrity. And he, among his friends, there were doctors, lawyers. He had the gift of being able to speak to anybody at any level as an equal. He was a very lively person, passionate, a lot of fun. And I loved him dearly. I remember during the war, at one point, someone offered him the opportunity of buying a black market ham. And, at that time food was rationed. And the man said, look, give me whatever it was, the money, I don't know, £5, whatever. And go to that, certain place at such and such a time, and we'll give you the ham. Needless to say, the guy didn't show up. Now, Percy, anybody else would have probably never told anybody about this misadventure. Percy told us all as a lesson. And I think that says a lot for him. Another similar thing is at some point he got rather heavily into gambling on horses and whatever, and dog races. He was a bit of a gambler. And at some point he got out of hand. And he stopped it cold, and he again told us about it. That you don't gamble, it can get, to the point where you can't cope with it anymore, and he stopped. And I've always admired him for that, for turning something, his own character defects into lessons for us. I found they're very, very admirable. Of course, we were fans of the Norwich City Football Club. Used to go to matches very often.
Were you evacuated at any point? I mean, was there
No,
any
Norwich
threat?
was bombed quite heavily.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, over 1,000 people were killed in that rather small town, well, a town of about 100,000. But no, we weren't evacuated any further than that. What can I say about life there?
Do you remember any of the, did you participate in their family, their extended family?
Yes, yes. I was a full-fledged member, except that I think I withdrew at times, and I learned this years later. When the summer holidays came around, I used to go off camping with the Boy Scouts. And I always thought that, well, the Cohens, they sent me, they said, go with the Boy Scouts, and they went to the seaside or whatever. Years later, not that long ago, Mariam told me that it was my choice, and they were rather hurt that I didn't want to go away with them. And I guess knowing in the back of my mind that my parents may be around someday, I was afraid to form really close relationships with them and preferred to keep myself apart like in the Scouts. And I think some of this stays with me, a little difficulty sometime of wholly committing and you know.
How about forming relations with people? Do you keep a distance?
Well, in some ways I do even now.
Mm-hmm.
Not as much as I used to, but there is always a little bit of that there, of being not 100% in one place because I don't know exactly where I belong.
Mm-hmm. What do you, I mean, you were pretty young, so you could adopt a lot of the customs of England. Were there any customs you remember finding difficult to adopt?
No, I made sure I adopted every, English custom. Also, Mama Brenda saw to it that we learned our perfect English table manners and spoke properly and so on. Her family had come from Romania.
Mm. And let's go back to when you met up. You said your father got a job. What type of work did he find then when he was in Toulouse?
In Toulouse. He got a job as a presser for a very small family-run clothing factory. Father come down from a bank manager, but he was on the end of our block, this family where, the husband owned the place and did, I guess, the business end. There was a cutter, and my father was a presser, and his wife and another woman did the sewing, and that was a factory. And they made various types of clothing, and in fact my father brought back some to do at home on home sewing machine, piecework, and I also helped on that, so I used the sewing machine.
And did your mom do any work?
No. My mother kept house. My grandmother helped, of course.
She lived with you?
She lived with us. She did also some of the cooking. In fact, my mother, come to think of it, didn't do very much. My father was probably the best cook, and my mother didn't cook very much. She certainly didn't iron, my father did.
Well, when it became apparent that you weren't the 7-year-old anymore, was there an adaptation that took place?
Well, it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy. I can't, eventually I sort of broke free and I went out and I met girls and all the normal stuff. But, they were always very worried about me.
And do you think that was because they thought of you as a young child, or do you think that was
Well, it was a mixture of a young child, also my mother's fear of what had happened to her brother.
Mm-hmm. And what other ways did you feel that they were treating you not as someone of the age you were?
I think my mother also tried to constantly buy my love, so to speak, through French pastry, with the result that at that time I was skinny as a rail, but later on, I'm afraid I put on weight and I still like that kind of stuff. So food did play a large role in our lives. We went to the synagogue once in a while, and I remember one service where the rabbi, who was dressed very much the same as a Catholic priest would be dressed, long black, what's it called, a soutane in French, a sort of frock down to the ground, and a large brimmed hat, something like Don Basilio in the Barber of Seville, but that was cleric's attire for the rabbi, the big black beard, and there was some celebration where all the dignitaries of the town came to the synagogue, and I remember he closed his speech by saying that no one can say that the unknown soldier buried in the tomb of the unknown soldier could not have been a Jew. So it struck me. Of course, it's true.
Yeah. Now, how long were you living there then with your family?
Well, I was living from 1947 and came to the United States in '56. In between, though, there were a couple of side tours. When I first arrived in France, I went to a special class at Toulouse University for foreigners. There were classes given for foreigners who wanted to learn French, and I went to those and learned French. I also learned French by going to the movies, especially seeing movies I'd seen in English which were now dubbed into French. I understood French fairly rapidly, but I was very, very shy about speaking it for much longer than that.
So you still had the communication gap then?
Yes, yes. I never developed a really good French accent. In school, I did well, but I could never write at the same level in French without grammatical mistakes as others. And the French school leaving sort of diploma, the baccalaureate, is given in two parts. The first part I took, and I got notification that I'd failed. And so at that point I decided to chuck school and I wanted to go back to England. And I had my mother's dearest friend and oldest friend who lived in London, Aunt Helen. She wasn't really an aunt, but she was the nearest thing I had. And she got me a job in the place she worked in London for 1 year. So I went over as a student trainee and spent a wonderful year in London. Thinking, you know, I'd made arrangements to do this. And I figured no point going on in school, I never pass. But then I received word that I had failed the baccalaureate because I had got below the minimum required in French. In all the other subjects I'd done very well. So I took just before leaving for England, I took the exam again and passed. But I was determined to go to England, so I dropped out of school before really fully graduating from a French high school and going on for the second part of the baccalaureate. And that was probably a mistake. Anyway, that year in England was very delightful. I lived in London, I had a job, I felt utterly wealthy on £6 a week. I dated dozens of girls. I went to the theater at least 3 times a week. It was a wonderful life.
Did you get in touch with any of your old former friends?
Yes, I went to Norwich frequently, visited the Cohens. Yes, I did all that. In fact, on weekends I went up there very often. But then the year was up and I had to return to France. And had to return to military service, because everybody in France was drafted, unless you were blind or something. So I was drafted into French infantry, or what was known as the colonial infantry, which had sort of roots in the French colonies. And I went through basic training in Carcassonne, which is a rather interesting town. It has its largest medieval fortress, which is in Europe. And, it was basic training. It was all right. I mean, it was nothing sensational. And to my surprise, I was sent to officer school. Apparently, in France, they select their future leaders based on what amounts to IQ tests, not an ability to lead or anything, which makes some sense. And anyway, I went to officer school, or reserve officer school to be specific, for 6 months and came out as a second lieutenant, and then served my last 6 months in the port of Toulon, with a group of Senegalese, with whom which I commanded, as well as some, Frenchmen. And I have to say I rather enjoyed being a soldier. Fortunately, there was no war at that time. It was one of the rare periods between wars. And in fact, our officers who trained us were so careful of us that never should anything, happen to us, because they had just come back from the French adventure in Indochina, and and one of them used to walk with such joy. He said, it's such a pleasure to walk somewhere in the woods and not be afraid of putting your foot on something, on a mine or something. So I have other warm memories of that period.
So why did you like the military? Why did you enjoy it?
I guess because the first time I was succeeding at something in France. I was apparently good at it. I knew I had a fairly loud voice. I could issue orders. I was popular with the men. I could, I summoned up the courage to speak. I could teach people. I was successful for the first time. I also had the certain amount of freedom after the initial basic training. I sort of liked it. I did vaguely consider signing on again, but wisdom prevailed, luckily.
So when did you finish your service? When was that?
Well, it was only 18 months required at that time. So I finished it, and then I needed a job. Again, I didn't want to go back to my parents. So I got a job in Paris. I was a glorified errand boy for a small clothing manufacturer. I used to pack things up and run errands.
But that was okay with you because you were in Paris.
Well, I thought it would be. Actually, it was one of the most miserable times of my life. I had no money. I rented a room in the Arab quarter, which was very poor and very noisy, and with people who barely spoke French. And it was really quite miserable. And after a few months, I returned to Toulouse and realized that I'd better do something with my life. And so...
So how old were you at this point?
About 22. After the army, about 22. And it turns out that at that time, France had the best educational system probably in the world. But it was so selective that they didn't produce enough people that were needed, skilled people. So the Minister of Labor took over and offered courses in various topics, which lasted a year, for which you got paid. And after which you would be trained as something. And I took a whole slew of exams for those, and passed some of them. And the first one that came through happened to have the training center in Toulouse, so I wouldn't have to leave. And it trained people to be construction superintendents. So I went to this school for 9 months plus 3 months work experience on building a bridge in the Pyrenees. And then I got a job, and a good one, working for a highway contractor who was building bypasses around, just starting to build bypasses around big cities like Toulouse. And again, I enjoyed it. I used to get around on a motor scooter, and if the senior man didn't use it, I got a small car. And it was interesting work, construction. In fact, I sometimes wish I'd stayed with it. And after a year, though, our number came up in terms of the quota system, and our visas arrived to go to the United States. And so the family, in 1956, boarded the Liberté and came to the United States.
Did you resist going?
No, slightly, but I realized that probably the future was for me in the States. I realized that in France, I really would always be slightly handicapped by my accent. I would be always something of an outsider. I had a great deal of affection and admiration for France in many ways, especially the educational system and many others, beauty and, the culture. But I figured, I came to the States, and I haven't regretted that.
Did you feel like an outsider in England?
Slightly.
And how about in the United States?
In New York, for the first time, after, initially settling down, I discovered I wasn't an outsider. I got a job within 2 weeks of arriving, working for a surveyor, which is one of the skills I'd learned, doing surveys and drafting. And I was paid $50 a week, And I felt ultra wealthy on that at that time, because I realized that I could buy a pair of shoes for $10. That's a day's work for a pair of shoes. In France, it would be more like 2 weeks' work for a pair of shoes. And I made a good salary in France for someone that young. The man who ran this small surveying shop, Mr. Julius Harwood, encouraged me. He said, you have to go to school. And he told me to. And I did start. I took a class in mathematics at City University, got a D in it, and thought, oh, well, I'm no good at that. Because I hadn't done it for ages. And, but Julius Harwood said, look, why don't you try my old school, Polytechnic Institute of Brooklyn. So I went there, and I used to, after work, 2 or 3 evenings a week, take the subway or walk across the Brooklyn Bridge to Brooklyn Poly and take classes from 6 till 10.
So you lived on the Lower East Side?
No, we lived in Queens.
In Queens, okay.
In Queens, Flushing. And I discovered I did very well in school, especially in English. My English was far superior to just about any, to anybody else in the class who was a local American, with the exception of someone who was Irish. He wrote better than I did. And I discovered that once I got into it, I liked mathematics. I started out as a civil engineer, discovered that I could get a degree earlier, a year earlier, if I switched to mathematics. After 2 years going part-time, I went full-time the last 2 years, while still continuing to work, more or less full-time for Julius Harwood. And in 1960, I got my bachelor's degree in mathematics with honors. And companies were lining up for my services. I had a choice between IBM and Brookhaven National Lab. And for some reason, I liked Brookhaven National Lab. And I worked there from 1960 until I retired in 1995.
Amazing. Wow.
So well, that's the story.
Kurt, I wondered, when did you start getting interested in photography?
At some point, I've always been interested in taking snapshots. In fact, my father and I used to take pictures in France and enlarge them with a home-built enlarger consisted of an old camera placed on its side and using that as an enlarger. He taught me how to enlarge and how to develop.
So he had an interest?
Yes, my father was a good photographer too. And he was very good with his hand. He could always put things together. There I do not take after him. But at some point I took a course in it and had the doubtful luck of having one of my first efforts be a really spectacular shot. It was at the time of the Vietnam peace protests, and I took a picture of a young couple at a candlelit ceremony, just illuminated by candlelight and carrying a piece of paper on which was written "For Peace." And it was really a very good picture. So I was hooked. I've never taken another picture that was anywhere near as good. But I have, I used to do my own black and white. After a while, I actually worked, I used to do the publicity shots for an amateur theater group, and I did it for a long time, and now, then I dropped it for perhaps 15 years, and now I'm trying to get back into it.
I was also wondering, how do you think you've had various disruptions and moving in various points in your life? You would be settled, and then you would move, and you'd be settled. How do you think that's affected your life in your adult years?
Well, I've always been 2 years behind. It cost me about 2 years. I graduated from college in 1960 when I was 29. So it's probably more than 2 years. Most people graduated about 22. That's with the year out I lost in France, and whatever. So I graduated in 60 when I was 29. So I was always a bit behind. I suppose if without those interruptions, I would have graduated early, started my work career earlier, and without floating around doing odd jobs and what have you, and dead ends and the like.
Do you think you assimilate quickly or slowly to new situations?
I assimilate extremely quickly and forget the old, which is not, I think, all that good. I mean, I really sort of almost draw a curtain on the past, and in fact, sometimes, I don't now anymore, used to fantasize about sort of being dropped in a new town, leaving everything else behind, and completely starting afresh. Used to be a fantasy, you know, and yet this was probably reliving what in some ways must have been the worst experiences of my life, and yet part of me enjoyed that thrill. And I've never quite come to grips with that.
And you don't know what aspect of it is that attracts you to it?
I don't really know. I think it's also the freedom to not have perhaps my mother leaning over me and worrying. I think that I found terribly suffocating.
When you had come to the States and you were off on your own, did you feel your mother carried on this type of behavior?
Well, less so after a while. I mean, I did after being in the country for 2 years. I got married for the first time. It was unfortunately a mistake. I was still a newcomer in this country. I didn't quite know what I was doing. I was going to school nights and working and with a surveyor and didn't see quite what my future, course should be. And I met this woman who had a doctorate, who was a psychologist and a professor at the university. And I guess I was very impressed with her. She was nice to me, and I sort of looked at her as something of a mentor, and I guess she wanted someone she could be a mentor to. So we married.
Was she the same age as you?
No, she was 5 years older than I was. And
what is her name?
Her name was Judith Cowan. And some years down the road, I now made a good salary myself. I no longer needed a mentor, and I didn't want to have someone who sort of, wanted to take charge of me. And I'm afraid the marriage foundered after that. It was sad because she's alive and very, very lively, a very wonderful person, but it was, based on a premise which didn't last, so to speak. Curiously enough, she, some years ago, married a man who is an amazing man. He writes poetry, he skis, hikes, and he's blind.
Oh my gosh.
So here's somebody who will need her and isn't going to outgrow that. So she's happy, and I'm very glad for her. In the meantime, of course, Judy and I had 2 children together, Rachel, born in 1960, and Jennifer, born in 1964.
And then since then you've gotten remarried to...
Yes, we separated in 1974 and subsequently divorced, and in 1978 I remarried to my current wife. And at the time my parents were worried, you're going to have 3 stepdaughters you're going to have to take care of. Well, it turns out it was one of the best things that happened to me. They're lovely girls, and I'm very fond of them and their children.
What would you, if you could put in some sort of concise way, what do you feel would be a message that you would like to pass on to the future generations that's something that you have learned as a result of your years?
Well, don't knock immigrants. All this movement to limit immigration, I think immigrants generally do rather well based on my perhaps limited experience and those of the other kinder. I mean, we're talking today downstairs that overall the average achievement level of immigrants has been rather higher than the average around, of the country. So I think that I would be rather opposed to limiting immigration, to people unless they had a mile-long criminal record. That's one thing. And the other one is to keep an open mind and to, about different cultures, understand that every culture has its own merits. And something that has, helped the people, whoever they are, survive for centuries, has a lot going for it. And you don't sort of say, oh, well, in the old country we used to do it this way. It's, yes, but in the new country do it this way, and both work in their respective countries.
And is there anything that you want to talk about that you would like to have your family remember that we haven't talked about?
Oh dear. Well, I think one of the inhibitions I had in England was that the fear of showing any sexual interest as I became an adolescent. I thought this was terrible and bad, and I must never show any such interest. Whereas I think a child who's born into a family wouldn't be afraid. See, I had the fear, totally unjustified, but the fear nevertheless, that if I did something bad, I would be shipped out of the family into an orphanage. And indeed, there was another member, or a friend of the Cohens, who got a young man from Austria, a bit older than me, who was really terrible and obnoxious, and eventually he got shipped to, I guess, some group home or wherever. And the feeling is that, this was a fear, so I had to be ultra good always. And of course my impulses were not all that good. So that conflict and this inhibition, I think, is something I wish I'd been able to resolve better.
And it's something that you've thought about over the years,
yes.
Or something you're just starting to think about?
No, I thought about it over the years.
Mm-hmm. And have you thought about, has this ever been a contemplation of yours to think about how your life would have been had you not had the war intervene versus...
Yes, it has. I thought that, well, one thing I could be fairly sure of, I would have had brothers and sisters.
Did your mother say that to you?
Yes, I think I mentioned earlier that she just said that she had she told me fairly recently that she'd had an abortion.
No, you didn't mention
I didn't.
that.
All right. She told me this was not long before she died that she had an abortion because it was no time to bring another Jewish child into the world. This was, I think, either when they first got to France or around about the time when Hitler came to power. I don't know exactly when. And this sort of rather shocked me, or rather saddened me, because, an only child is not, it's sad in some ways. Of course, I, have my foster brother, and my, Connie used to worry about when she first met me. I told her I was an only child, and then the next sentence that I had a brother, so...
And were there any other aspects that come to mind?
Well, I think I was also very unassertive and shy for a long time, and indeed still am to some degree. But, gradually I've come to grips with it to some degree. I've overcome it, and I accept my, at this point, my failings in other areas. I'm somewhat disorganized, untidy, all right, This is life, and I've become more accepting, I think, of myself.
And do you consider yourself American?
Yes, certainly more than anything else. But if someone asks me, a stranger, what's your hometown? I say it's Norwich in England, not Vienna. But that's what I feel. I don't speak the language, I don't have any particularly warm memories of Vienna. So yes, I'm American with Anglo-French background.
All right. If there's anything else you want to talk about, otherwise I think
I think that's probably all I can think of for the moment, and
okay,
it's a lot more than I expected to think of.